Good morning. I'm Fırat Oruç from Georgetown University in Qatar, and it has been really a fascinating first day set of panels, and it gives me a great pleasure to moderate the first panel for today, titled Tributaries, Ecology, Economy, and Society in the Indian Ocean Histories. We have three distinguished panelists. I will invite them in the order of the program. Each panelist will offer 30 minutes of a presentation. Then this will leave us with 30 minutes for Q&A session. If I think there is a clock there that, gives the time. But if for some reason I need to make a gentle warning, please look at me. Okay, great. Our first speaker is Pedro Machado, who is an associate professor of history and the director of DAR Indian Studies program at Indiana University. The title of his presentation is Ecology as Economic Assemblage, Ivory, Shell, and Relational Geographies of Extraction in the Indian Ocean. Pedro, please.
Well, good morning, everyone. Nice to see some old friends and some new faces. I want to thank the organizers for the invitation. It's a real privilege to be here, and I welcome the opportunity. All right, I'll dive right in. Not for the first time, Valji Ambaitis was facing a difficult decision in late April of 1781 that required careful consideration. He could sail the short distance from Mozambique Island to the mainland directly opposite. We own Palmares, this is sort of land and property, at Mossadegh. This is close to Mozambique Island, that functioned as trading posts and storage facilities to contract with his patamares. These were African agents, key to the logics of exchange, information gathering, and sharing, for another expedition from the coast to the interior to meet regional Makua traders and the large Yao trading caravans who were linchpins in the economic life of northern Mozambique. This would have required transporting a large number of bales of Gujarati cotton cloths, the currency of the land, from a warehouse on Mozambique Island, the short distance to where his batel was docked, a type of vessel, and across the narrow passage to coastal Makuana. This was the sort of mainland directly opposite Mozambique Island, and the narrow passage to coastal Makuana and his Palmares, an itinerary he knew well from regular crossings that he had made since arriving in Mozambique in the mid-1770s as the principal agent of his trading firm. There was, though, a further possibility to ponder, one that was less familiar to him and his partners at the time. Outfitting a corvetta, another sort of vessel, for the long and considerably more hazardous voyage through the Mozambique Channel to Quelimane, a coastal entrepot gaining in significance as a conduit through which trade goods flowed into and out of the Zambezi Valley. While the trade at Mossadegh had been sustaining his family firm's interests in Southeast Africa, recent challenges were prompting him to consider seriously expanding the commercial geographies of his firm's involvement and investments in Mozambique. Well, this would have entailed the far greater risk of a more dangerous voyage, as well as paying for the use of warehouse storage at Quelimane and introductions to Vashambadzi. These were itinerary African sort of intermediary agents in the Zambezi Valley. Valji made the decision, despite the sort of increased risk, in consultation with his brother, to send his corvetta south with a cargo of over 10,000 pieces of Gujarati cottons. What drew Valji Ambaitis to Quelimane, as it did several other Gujarati Banya family firms in increasing number from the final quarter of the 18th century, as I've elaborated in previous work, was its growing prominence as a transshipment port for the thousands of tusks that African traders were transporting to the coast on canoes along the Zambezi River in the 18th century. Now, these were brought from an extraordinarily broad area, drawing on networks that stretched over long distances, encompassing areas with significant elephant herds. In particular, the savannas, marshlands, and forests of the hinterland bound by the Luangwa and Shire Valley were elephant-rich ecological zones exploited by elephant hunters. Tusks were brought to Quelimane, for example, by Bisa traders who acquired supplies from the state of the Eastern Lunda, and also supplied tusks to Yao traders along the Shire River Valley. They also traded, these Bisa traders also traded tusks to Zumbo at the far end of the Zambezi River, fueling a robust tusk extraction from elephant populations that were in the 18th century becoming a source of regional wealth, evolving political power, and catalysts for the deepening of translocal enmeshments in commercial radials stretching across the interiors, coasts, and waters of the Western Indian Ocean. So this, this piece sort of is in conversation, I guess, with Philip Gooding's presentation yesterday in some ways. At the same time, though, despite being largely overlooked in the scholarship, other extractive processes were broadening human-animal interactions and engagements in southeastern Africa. And I'll just go through some of these sort of quickly because I want to really focus on elephants and tusk extraction. So some of these extractive processes included, for example, eastern black rhinoceros hunts that resulted in the late 18th century in the exportation of up to 150 kilograms of rhino horn per year. As Adamji Premji, a prominent Panya merchant whose family firm owned several vessels in Mozambique Island that sailed along the northern and southern coasts of Mozambique, noted to the Portuguese governor at Mozambique in 1798, quote, "In the past 5 years, my boats have transported over 100 rhino horns north from Mozambique Island to Mukalla and Diu," end quote. Considerably smaller in scale, irregular traffic in hippopotamus teeth was also characteristic of the megafauna slaughter in northern, central, and southern Mozambique by this time. This is, of course, an image from a much later period. The trouble at times with these earlier periods is that the images are, far less available. Well, it's clear that these animal products sustained regular hunting. How this was organized, where animals were taken, and how in the 18th century is unclear from the sources. However, an account from Zambezia and areas around the kingdom of Mwene Mutapa in the 1630s, from which at least some of the hippopotamus teeth continued to be traded north to Mozambique Island, describes practices that involved hunting both on rivers and on land. Regarding rivers, it was noted that, quote, "The hunters have harpoons 1 braça long," this is a sort of a unit of measurement, "and wound around it 20 or 30 braças of thin but strong rope. They go in small boats. One of them rows and the other stands in the prow. 3 or 4 attack, each from a different, and when from time to time the hippopotamus lifts his head out of the water, the nearest man spears him and drops the rope with a buoy attached and lets him go. When he's badly wounded, he hides in the bush and dies there, or is found by following the trail of blood and is finished off," end quote. When it came to hunting on land, specialists dug a deep hole and, quote, "and then in the bottom place a stump with an assegai wedged in it." An assegai is a kind of spear. "They disguise this opening to resemble the rest of the path. The animal falls into it and is impaled head downwards, and they finish him off," end quote. Excuse me. Yet another method used in, which is also there in elephant hunting, which I'll discuss shortly, entailed, quote, "the process of the hanging assegai," end quote, whereby hunters, quote, "take a thick stick and insert it into the iron of a big assegai and hang it among the trees together with a rope trap, and the animal is caught as he walks through it and remains speared in such a way that he cannot move forwards or backwards," end quote. Another notably large species was also hunted with great frequency in the late 18th and early decades of the 19th century, whales, likely elaborating pre-existing seasonal whale hunts by local communities in coastal southern Mozambique that were well established by the 16th century and served subsistence needs. In the late 17th, Dutch and English ships were trading in ambergris, while the latter French and American whalers were active in the later decades of the 18th century in Delagoa Bay. Large numbers of female whales sought sheltered bays in which to calve and suckle their young, and Delagoa Bay offered such protection. So you find a sort of a sustained period of intense activity from the 1780s until the first few years of the 19th. And it's been possible to estimate around 120 whaling ships were active in Delagoa Bay. The majority at this time were British and well provisioned by local Tembe chiefs who had turned by this time to supplying food to crews. Reflective of broader cetacean extraction and encounters in other oceanic spaces, this intensification of whaling in coastal southern Mozambique sort of denuded the waters of Delagoa Bay and its depths of great numbers of this marine species. And now, quite what the numbers were is hard to establish, but certainly there was a sustained human-animal encounter in the waters of southern Mozambique. It's difficult to deduce from the virtual disappearance of whalers by the 1820s and 1830s whether this was the result of severely depleted whale populations or that whales were learning to avoid ships and boats. It might also have been a reflection of the changes in the commercial orientation in southern Mozambique. On a smaller scale and undertaken with varying levels of activity is the lesser-known marine extraction of turtle and pearl shell at island sites. For instance, in the Bazaruto archipelago, located to the south of the Sabe River in southern Mozambique, the archaeological record shows that communities consumed but also traded in these marine products, as well as hunting dugongs for their teeth and harvesting shellfish as part of local diets. Although references are sporadic, it's clear at different periods that these islands and coastal northern Mozambique were abundant in shellfish and at different varieties and different varieties of fish. In the second half of the 18th century, Gujarati vessels sailed to Sofala and south to Bazaruto to purchase turtle shell from local inhabitants, whose seasonal gathering of turtles and turtle eggs sustained regular exports to Diu and Daman in Katiaba. It's a part of we consider southern Gujarat in a sense. From the 1770s, from the 1770s, Banya family firms were increasingly engaged in commerce with the southern ports of Mozambique, establishing themselves at Inhambane and Sofala. The Karumba Islands to the north of Mozambique Island, I should probably go back here to the map there, the Karumba Islands to the north of Mozambique Island became also incorporated into the coastal itineraries of Gujarati shipping, with regular voyages made there to trade for seed pearls and, more significantly, cowrie shells that were shipped to Surat, also in Gujarat. The diversity of this marine extraction, involving also Portuguese commercial interests, but overwhelmingly financed and organized by and through Banya firms, involved the labor extensively of enslaved agents who were responsible in many cases for sailing to and securing cargoes of these marine products. Now, these brief examples underscore how sites of ecological extraction are variously differentiated in a number of important ways, but are constituted by complex interactions of actors, social factors, and political imperatives. They are further often structured and articulated through particular exchange mechanisms and institutional frameworks that undergird commercial networks with radials extending across mutable spaces of economic life. Their dense interrelation animates the spatialities and temporalities that define extractive possibilities and shape geographies of human and non-human movement and mobility. Now, I want to explore this further by returning to the most significant site of animal-human interaction in East Central and Southeast Africa, elephants and the extraction of tusks at coastal and interior sites. And if I have the time to get through all of it, I hope to explore ways of thinking about how patterns of commercial movement, conceptualized through the boat and trading caravan, depended as much on animal migration as they did on merchant design. My discussion here will range geographically and temporally, but will mostly be concerned with periods from the 16th and 17th centuries into the early decades of the 19th. Now, I begin on the coast of northern Mozambique sometime around 1591, when João dos Santos, the celebrated Dominican missionary who spent 9 years at different Portuguese settlements along the coast in the far interior of the Zambezi Valley at Tete, experienced a life-threatening moment. During an afternoon visit to the convent at Cabeceira, on the mainland directly opposite Mozambique Island, he and his co-religionists were surprised by the sudden appearance of a highly agitated elephant that came storming in their direction. Before it could see them, however, they managed to run and hide in the nearby Catholic residence. The elephant, roaring and trumpeting loudly, continued its charge through palmares, these agricultural tracts, towards the coast. While the account does not explicitly note the size of the elephant, it was likely a bull elephant, an observer writing in the second decade of the century that they had seen, quote, very large elephants unquote, on the mainland opposite Mozambique Island. While Dos Santos and his fellow Dominicans were collecting themselves, a Makua man approached them sobbing, explaining through tears that his brother had a short time ago been killed by this very elephant. As rated by the deceased's brother, the man, a great hunter of elephants, had been tracking the elephant and its companion throughout the previous day. At nightfall, when the elephants lay down to sleep, as they usually do, the man crept up to one of them and drove his assegai hard into its groin with both hands, making a targeted strike where experience would have taught him that this method of killing, a slow and painful death over many hours, was fatal to an elephant. This appears to have been a commonly used way of killing elephants among hunters elsewhere in Mozambique, as accounts about hunting in the hinterlands of Sofala in the south by traders from Sena on the south bank of the Zambezi River attest. The blow would have roused the elephant, but the hunter was not there to see it, having fled home in the knowledge that he would return to finish the job the next day. And indeed, on the following day, he returned with his brother to the area where the elephants had been sleeping and followed the trail of blood left by the mortally wounded and therefore severely weakened and vulnerable animal so that he could finish the killing and complete the hunt. They tracked the elephant to a river a short distance away, where they saw, quote, the injured elephant at the water's edge, standing motionless or already faint from the great amount of blood that he had lost, end quote. Seemingly aware of the grave situation, his companion had gone into the river, this is the elephant's companion, where he was, quote, gathering water with his trunk and spraying the wounded elephant's face often so he would not faint completely, end quote. After observing from a safe distance and for, quote, a long time, end quote, this display of animal care and aid between the two elephants, the hunter grew impatient and advanced towards the wounded animal, intent on startling him with loud shouting, which he expected would result in the severely weakened elephant falling to the ground so that he could finish him off as he usually did with others. That was a quote. This tactic proved unsuccessful, however, for upon hearing the commotion, the elephant's companion rushed the man and killed him. In the same moment, the wounded elephant collapsed, quote, and died together with the hunter who had killed him, end quote. The companion elephant, still in his heightened state of agitation and possibly sensing that he might also be in danger, charged off to the area near the convent where Dos Santos and his fellow Dominicans encountered him. Now, how might this kind of account help us rethink the place of elephants and elephant ecologies in the evolving tusk networks and their enmeshments in translocal and global commercial systems? Tusk extraction and the by now well-developed historical literature on the ivory trade of East Central and Southeast Africa that has made clear how integral it was to the creation of linkages braiding different parts of the coast and interior to the worlds of the Indian Ocean, seldom considers elephants or their place in shaping the contours of these linkages. While mediated through the account provided to us by Dos Santos and never explicitly stated, a clear sense emerges from the account that it was plain to the Makua man, to this Makua hunter and his brother, that the elephants, and perhaps most clearly the elephant that had killed the hunter and stampeded across the Palmares, had behaved in a purposeful and perhaps predictable way. As actors whose movements, actions, and reactions shape particular geographies of human mobility and that of other animals, and thereby mark the possibilities as much for daily life as it did for economic life, the elephants had indeed exhibited willful behavior. In other words, they had agency, a point, of course, that the rapidly growing literature in animal studies and history has regarded as a point of departure for the field. Now, Dos Santos devotes only a handful of pages in his Ethiopia Oriental, a voluminous work detailing the relations of the Portuguese with African people in Sofala and its interior south of the Zambezi River, to elephants, the hunters who pursued them, and the communities who lived with these large animals. But as a product of encounters between humans and animals, these pages nonetheless capture important details about this relationship and invite us to think with elephants. Now, I want to clarify, following some new work, that my use of agency is not aimed at recovering the subjectivity of animal life, right? The subjective experiences of animal life, as central as this is in some of the animal history literature, but rather in considering agency to be the effect of material entanglements and networks between interacting entities. Again, as recent work in sort of animal studies, argues, at least to a certain degree, agency in this relational model is not a kind of innate ability possessed by some historical actors, enabling them to affect the world around them through intentional acts, but instead is the material effects of encounters between different ecological actors. So agency, as a recent scholar has argued, is the result of the entanglement of these actors and the capacities, actions, and behaviors. So framed in this way, African savanna elephants of the kind encountered by the Makua hunter can be conceived as actors in agential entanglements, since their lives were bound up with imperial interests, commercial imperatives, and the currents of an expanding translocal tusk economy extending into the radials of the Western Indian Ocean and beyond. Now, by the time that Dos Santos was writing, specialized elephant hunters, such as the aforementioned Makua hunter, were found among different African groups throughout northern and central parts of what is today Mozambique, but also encompassing Malawi and the Zimbabwean plateau. Encounters between elephants and humans would thus have been common occurrences. Though we don't have really reliable quantitative information for herd sizes and projections from more recent periods, especially the second half of the 19th century, for which there's greater evidence, are problematic for a number of reasons. Nonetheless, excuse me, if we assume that the Makua hunter was operating in terrain where they normally carried out this activity, the evidence from Dos Santos would suggest that elephants were found in the immediate coastal hinterland of Mozambique Island in the late 16th century in at least sizable numbers and were killed primarily as a source of food. Now, this is made clear in his work, where he goes into some detail about how elephant carcasses were cut up and the meat apportioned. So in the area where this elephant was killed, several Makua villages and local inhabitants of the Palmares appeared around the dead animal and began to, quote, cut up the elephant in order to take home their portion, end quote. The dead hunter's brother received the tusks, an entire leg and the trunk, quote, which is of the greatest esteem for hunters because they gain a lot with it, the trunk, carrying it around to the villages and places of the Africans where it is paraded and seeing it. The Africans always give something as they have disdain for the elephants because they destroy their crops, end quote. As Ned Elpis, for instance, has recently also argued, cohabitation could thus be a mutually fraught experience as much as Philip Gooding yesterday reminded us, could also be a symbiotic relationship. Human settlement was defined, at least in part, by the patterns of elephant mobilities as they traversed the landscape. How elephants affected and marked this landscape, whether by pushing over trees, bull elephants could knock over 3 to 5 trees per day, eating palm fronds from palmares, trampling over garden plots, or opening up roads to drinking holes, reflected the particular dietary intake of large animals whose bioenergy needs were significant. These also made them, of course, vulnerable at times of drought, for instance, as Mozambique experienced between the 1650s and 1740s. Elephant movements could be tracked around remaining water sources and thus became predictable and ultimately more easily tracked by hunters. So again, patterns of elephant movement were also, though, influenced by human settlement and could display what we might consider an aversion to its presence, again, as Ned Elpis has argued recently, at least in more populated areas. So on the Zimbabwe plateau, for instance, almost 4 decades before Dos Santos was writing, there are reports of elephants avoiding the heavily populated areas around the center of Mwene Mutapa, and instead roaming the open plains, quote, where they go about in droves like a herd of cows. And so this animal strategy of removal from centers of dense human habitation didn't, though, insulate them from being killed by hunters, with up to 5,000 elephants perishing each year. While perhaps an exaggeration, this figure nonetheless reflects how firmly established elephant encounters through hunting were among African groups by the middle of the 16th century, and along with encounters in gardens or plots of land through which elephants would roam in search of food, these would grow over subsequent centuries across many areas of central, southern, and northern Mozambique, as the demand for tusks expanded as an imbricating element of the deepening integration of hinterlands and coasts into Indian Ocean and imperial commercial networks. Now, this expansion was, of course, differentiated across periods and shaped by a variety of factors that reflected social, political, and ecological dynamics and the imperatives of an intensifying tusk economy. So early periods of Portuguese involvement at Sofala in the south make clear the existence of a robust trade in tusks that persisted into the 17th and was the product of elephant hunting in the immediate coastal hinterland. Indeed, elephants appear to have been roaming coastal hinterlands all the way up to Mozambique Island and even up to Malindi, at least until the 18th century. By this time, and especially from the 1730s and 1740s, tusks in their hundreds were being transported through Makuana, again, the mainland opposite Mozambique Island, to Mozambique Island. And as is well established, these were brought to the coast by Yao long-distance traders from east of Lake Nyasa, who would establish themselves as the preeminent African traders of northern Mozambique. I've sort of talked about this in, a first book, Yao ivory cargoes constituted roughly about 75% of all tusks being exported. And this was really a significant quantity of tusks between, for instance, the 1759 and the early 1760s, about 62, 63, over 500,000 kilograms of tusks were shipped from Mozambique, with as much as 173,000 kilograms exported in a single year. But as I've shown, previously in other work, in the second half of the 18th century and into the early decades of the 19th, things changed, right? Tusks became increasingly drawn from areas other than the traditional markets of northern Mozambique, east central Africa. Although Yao traders continued to transport tusks to the coastal hinterland in exchange for Gujarati cotton cloths until at least the 1810s, there was a gradual redirection in their cargoes. And so someone like Velji Ambaitis, with whom I started this paper, represents one of the family firms who spurred and sustained a diversification away from the north to the south, and the sort of further intensification of ivory hunting in central and southern Mozambique. So Gujarati, the Gujarati commercial focus shifts to Keliman and other southern ports, and merchants established trading stores in Sena and in the Zambezi Valley, whose commercial structure was dominated increasingly by Prazeros and their Chikunda traders, porters, canoemen, and importantly, elephant hunters. Large elephant herds continued to exist in the savannas and forests adjacent to the Zambezi River, the marshlands near the confluence of the Shire and Zambezi waterways, and the Luanga Valley. In the dry season, when they migrated in search of water, additional herds could be found at the Zambezi, Shire, and Luangwa rivers. Elephant encounters through hunting thus spread rapidly across these sites as Chikunda caravans and men associated with the Prazo system of the Zambezi Valley that lay at the heart of Afro-Portuguese society, and the Vashambadzi, these sort of itinerant traders, that sort of undergirded this encounter. I will really talk more about the sort of, the involvement of Gujarati merchants and their sort of place in this. But these sort of this intensified exploitation of elephant-rich ecological areas of Zambezia kind of reflected the burgeoning demand for tusks connected to demand currents from Indian Ocean markets. I'll skip over some parts here because I'm running out of time. And certainly by the sort of middle of the 18th century, the 1750s, 1760s, 1770s, human-elephant encounters were predominantly defined by the logics of an extractive tusk economy, overwhelmingly focused on securing supplies for translocal and global markets. So tusks increasingly were something to sell rather than consume. But this, just briefly, shouldn't obscure the quite deep histories of African consumption of ivory, right, itself. So we have evidence, going back to early periods using the archaeological record of certain types of bangles, for instance, being fashioned. I won't go into that in detail. I do, though, want to make a case for as the nature of human-elephant encounters changed from the 18th century and took on different meanings in the 19th, I want to consider the processes and mechanisms through which tusks became ivory and a form of capital. Given the centrality in structuring the mechanisms that undergo this encounter, here I think Gujarati Banya, the forms of contracting, and the customs house play an important role. I might just, finish on the point about sort of, capital, because I think I'm running out of time. So I'll just move quickly through this, but I think it's an important point. Unlike in some other parts of the imperial world, elephants in East Central and Southeast Africa, as more generally across Central Africa, were not conscripted into imperial labor projects involving force and violence. Elephants were not, for instance, purchased to labor in extractive industries as they were in colonial Burma, where they were integral to the commercial exploitation of the country's vast forests, and here, specifically the booming teak industry from the late 19th century. The purchase and ownership of elephants in Burma gave imperial trading firms an advantage over smaller scale Burmese outfits and even the government of Burma. Elephants thus became a peculiar form of capital, as Jonathan Saha has argued, where their, quote, agential capacities, their corporeality, mobility, and intelligence were highly valued by timber firms. Invoking Donna Haraway's conceptualization, Saha sees Burmese elephants as constitutive of lively capital, animate actors whose value was based on their behaviors and capacities as living beings. Yet, as he argues, because elephants were never fully domesticated and the commodity status was thus one that required almost constant human labor to maintain, Saha argues that the concept of lively capital requires elaboration. Working elephants were valued for the capacities when put to use for particular productive tasks in the teak industry. Engaging Marx, he sees working elephants as capital deployed as a means of production. Right? He goes on to say that, for Marx, the means of production, or what he called constant capital, represented dead labor, right? By this, Marx meant that constant capital, like conveyor belts or furnaces, for instance, and as Saha contends, elephants cannot produce value or surplus value by themselves. Having been produced through human labor, when set to work, they need to be operated, maintained, and repaired, he goes on to note, in a multitude of ways that demand further labor to produce value. Without this attention, constant capital wore down and lost its exchange value at a quicker rate. Using Marx's own metaphor, Saha contends constant capital feeds on living labor like a vampire. And I'll just read this quote from Saha. Acknowledging that elephants were agents in the teak industry means that Marx's conceptualization of labor as exclusively human must be rejected. Nonetheless, by bringing this notion of constant capital as dead into dialogue with Haraway's idea of lively capital, elephants can be considered both living, valued for their agential capacities, and dead, demanding the labor of others to produce value. In other words, working elephants can be thought of as undead capital, end quote. Now, the picture in East Central and Southeast Africa is, of course, very different, markedly different, for it wasn't elephants that were rendered as commodities, but rather their tusks. Elephants were not put to productive tasks. They were not capital deployed as a means of production. However, through material contests, hunting, killing, elephants were brought from the 18th century and early 19th, increasingly into an extractive relation with humans that centered on their tusks. I want to suggest then that we think of African elephants as dead capital in the sense that the labor of others, professionalized hunters, canoemen, and caravan leaders was required to produce value. But the production of value was embedded within and a constitutive element of the interpenetrating and relational dynamics of African labor and the credit economy around which imperial and oceanic exchange was organized and in which Gujarati Banya family firms were central. I'll wrap up. The financing of this extractive animal economy and the forms of contracting that were developed among family agents and between them and the African intermediaries, most importantly with Vashambadzi in central Mozambique, is something I've explored in other work, but I didn't really consider its place in rendering elephant tusks as dead capital. That the extraction was not linked to the labor of the animal, but rather to its literal death, makes this commodified rendering, common throughout much of the African continent, also contingent on the nature of other extractive practices, local ecological constraints, and their relationship in structuring imperial and oceanic economies. I go on to sort of talk about the process of commodification through the sort of customs house and how tusks become ivory, but I won't elaborate that here, but I'm happy to take some questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Pedro. Our second panelist is Wilson Jacob. He's a professor of history at Concordia University, Canada. And the title of his presentation is When the Subaltern Prophecies, African Slaves, Arab Saints, and Nature in Southern Arabia. Please.
Good morning. First, a word of thanks to the Africa Institute for hosting this wonderful conference, especially thanks to Rogaya for getting me invited. This sort of began in Doha as this paper, as a mea culpa, after the publication of my last book, and reflecting on what to do next. The sort of, as one does, I suppose, the gaps in the second book seemed quite, vast, particularly in terms of subaltern figures, whether it's the tribes of southern Arabia or the slaves who inhabited southern Arabia or the peasants of Kerala, of Malabar. They feature nowhere in that book because my sense was that, the noble Sayyid Fadl that I wrote about, who, is a descendant of Prophet Muhammad, was a relatively unknown figure himself. And my job was to make him known, to study his works, and to trace out a life that is very unique in some ways, but also part of a deep tradition that isn't that well known, right? So in that process, many things got left to the side. And so at a conference similar to this in Doha, I started to think about, what can one do in the absence of records, right? A lot of the reasons why there are those absences is because the kinds of things Said Fadl wrote in the 19th century don't exist for other kinds of figures. And so that paper was mostly this mea culpa. And this iteration of it is an attempt to sort of move beyond that and provide something more than what might be considered a navel-gazing project. But some apologies to begin with. This is not a very well-developed paper. In some ways, it continues to be an auto-critique and perhaps a disciplinary critique, but it's not. There are some swipes in the paper, but it really isn't meant to dismiss the value of history as a discipline, but to question or to continue to question what are its limits, which may come from a midlife crisis, since that is where I'm at the moment, assuming I live to 100. And it could be, an ongoing reflection. And Professor Hoffmeyer's author that she buried in the garden, Coetzee, yesterday, she talked to us about. But for me, Coetzee's novel, Elizabeth Costello, sort of got buried in my head. And it's this reflection on the humanities in Africa, right? Like, why? What does it do for Africa and Africans? So that was there in my head for years and years. And perhaps now I'm going to sort of, perform an auto-critique that tries to move forward as well. This was a paper that was meant to be read, not really spoken, because there are these experimental parts that involve the interpolation of Quranic verses. So it will sound a little weird, but bear with me. And thank you for your indulgence. Surat Al-An'am 165, Al-Quran Al-Karim. It is He who hath made you His agents, inheritors of the earth. He hath raised you in ranks, some above others, that he may try you in the gifts he hath given you. For thy Lord is quick in punishment, yet he is indeed oft forgiving, most merciful. Yusuf Ali's translation. And it is he who has made you successors upon the earth, Sahih International Translation. He it is who hath placed you as viceroys, vicegerents, Marmaduke Pickthall's translation. وَهُوَ الَّذِي جَعَلْكُمْ خَلَائِفَ الْأَرْضِ, the Quran. Worries, wonders, and weather. Speculating Said. Said sat on the steps of the Samiri shrine and contemplated the latest trial that he and his fellow Zofaris faced. He wondered if there would ever be rain again, as the period of drought dragged on, month after hot month, year after horrible year. By his reckoning, this unprecedented wave of hot, dry days began about 6 months into Sayyid Fadl bin Alawi's arrival in Zofar, or perhaps it was earlier. He could not be sure, because the Sayyid had been invited by the tribal heads of the Qara and the Kathiri to offer a solution to their incessant conflicts. And behind those conflicts was often the question of water. He knows that he began to feel something was seriously off with the cycle of winds and rains between Jumada Athani, 1292, and Rajab, 1293. August 1875 to August 1876. He would wonder in the few years after Sayyid Fadl's expulsion by the same warring tribes in Muharram 1296, when the return of the rain seemed to stall again, if the earlier episode of extreme weather had anything to do with past wrongs, and if anything could be done in the present to rectify those wrongs, and thereby secure the future for life over the horrible death that had been everywhere and that was threatening the denizens of Zofar again. Though Said had grown to develop a vague knowledge of Islam's history through the spread of shrines like the one he frequented, he did not remember his own history very clearly. He knows he had been captured outside his village, somewhere far from the shores of the East African coast, when he was still a mere child, and shipped in the crowded hull of a barely seaworthy dhow with other boys and other merchandise to the shores of southern Arabia. He had a vague, haunting image in his mind of elephant tusks everywhere. His arrival in Dhofar on the frontiers of Yemen and Oman was also only a hazy memory. He was purchased and brought into the household of a pious Arabic-speaking Muslim. His first clear recollections go back to the labor he was forced to undertake on the Sayyid's plantation. Muscle memory, perhaps. He remembers the grueling work of planting his first date and coconut palms and plantain trees. Growing them required an enormous amount of toil, from the deep pits that each sapling required to the constant weeding and whacking of pests. In the many years since, in certain moments, he thinks he understands the plants and animals of the area better than he does the humans, especially the ones of much higher rank than himself. This did not stop him, however, from expressing his opinions about the community and its moral conduct, particularly in its failures and when its peril seemed imminent, of course. Of course, by then, the master had passed and he too was advanced in years. Surah Al-Baqarah, 164, Al-Quran Al-Kareem. Indeed, in the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the alternation of the night and the day, and the great ships which sail through the sea with that which benefits people, and what Allah has sent down from the heavens of rain, giving life thereby to the earth after its lifelessness, and dispersing therein every kind of moving creature, and his directing of the winds and the clouds controlled between the heaven and earth are signs for a people who use reason. Perhaps his self-confidence to speak out from the precarious position of bonded servitude, wherein the slippage of human to non-human thing was a constant reality, issued from the time he invested pondering verses from the Quran that he was taught to read by his master. He could not read them easily on his own, but he loved to listen to their recitation. He was smitten by the beauty of the verses and their challenge to humans in conducting themselves properly in relation to the earth and its bounties, which in some way he knew included him and thousands like him all along the coast and into the interior. Those bounties, which did not know pride or vanity of the malignant variety, could only be possible with his continued service and the help of those forces that he knew were there but could not be seen. This latter was a belief surely shaped by his faith, but also by the reason with which he knew God had endowed him and expected him to use. He knew that the signs that seemed to intensify in their presences, and especially absences, were not for naught. Ignoring them had already brought enormous devastation. But not learning from the signs and not changing augured even worse. For the Quran made clear repeatedly, dwelling in ignorance had meant throughout history certain destruction of nations and replacement by others. His intimacy with the shrine of the Samiri in Zofar was what may have helped shape his opinion about the ousting of Sayyid Fadl, a scion of the noble Alawi line extending back to the Prophet Muhammad. The disrespect and disbelief behind the ouster of a genuine Sayyid would have represented one of those many prideful human errors which had exposed peoples in the past to the danger of destruction. He had heard of the many holy sites, the maqams, that were established over the centuries as Alawis like Fadl circulated, lived, and died around the Bahr al-Hind, down the coast of Africa to India and beyond. With the death of a blessed Alawi, acknowledged as saintly by local followers, much like Sayyid with his simple faith, shrines of varying shapes and grandeur were erected at their gravesite. Those shrines of Alawis, like that of Fadl's father in Malabar, and of other saints, like that of the Samiri in Zofar, became magnets focusing devotion, hopes, dreams, and visions of life as other. Said was present when travelers from Malabar came to pay respects and convey news to Sayyid Fadl. He likely heard some of that news, and he probably discovered that not everyone saw holy shrines as he did. The British, he may have learned, were the rulers of Malabar, and they had shut down the maqam of Sayyid Alawi in Mamburam, letting it slip into ruin. He would surely have cursed the British and prayed for the Alawis. Said did not dwell on what others were beginning to call a contradiction in the life of Sayyids, like Fadl, who owned people like himself, and went as far as rallying the Caliph of Islam in Istanbul to defend the right of Muslims to continue to buy, sell, and possess other humans. This at a time when more powerful empires like that of the British were working actively to stop the trade. He had heard rumors of some who had gone to Muscat and petitioned the British for their release from bonded service, in most cases only to be abandoned or transported to faraway locations to work for barely a shilling while enduring even more horrific conditions. God is great. God is merciful. With age and piety, Said's workload became lighter, and he became like a member of the family. He probably knew at some level, though, that a major reason for his recent situation was because younger workers had been purchased by his master a few years earlier, who now shouldered the burden of labor on the land. This was also probably why in his free time he could read and reflect on the Quran's truth. Accordingly, he would have reasoned in other directions from the abolitionism that was in the air. His thinking on the question of masters and slaves all began with the signs of God's ultimate dispensation, which engendered a trial to all who would lay claim to creation, irrespective of rank or station. Surat Al-Imran 97, Al-Quran Al-Kareem. In it are clear signs in the standing place, maqam, of Abraham. Whoever enters it should be safe. Pilgrimage to this house is an obligation by Allah upon whoever is able among the people, and whoever disbelieves, then surely Allah is not in need of any of his creation, the worlds. Surah Al-Baqarah 125. And remember, when we made the sacred house, the Kaaba, a center and a sanctuary for the people, saying, you may take the standing place, maqam, of Abraham as a site of prayer. And we entrusted Abraham and Ishmael to purify my house for those who circle it, who meditate in it, and who bow and prostrate themselves in prayer. Successors and vicegerents, a bountiful earth, a cyclical repetition of past, present, future, inviolable places and reason, another form of life, another earth, another time, space, and divine omniscience. Sophisticated theologies and political communities sprang from varying interpretations of Quranic concepts of being, time, and space. Said's confidence in speaking out about, in this case, the need to repair the maqam he visited every day after and sometimes during his work time in the fruit groves surrounding it was grounded in his simple faith and in his only limited understanding of the Quranic verses regarding the earth and human custodianship of it. In a harsh and often crushing environment, it was the simple faith, the divine injunction to use his reason and to expect a paradisical afterlife that gave him hope and forestalled despair. Surely becoming integrated into the community as a member of the master's household played its part too, but the faith and piety Said exhibited carried its own unique weight. The shrine or maqam whose disrepair concerned Said was and is steeped in stories that read like something out of the Ajaib al-Hind, bizarre wonders of India, genre of the classical Arabic belles lettres tradition, which could entwine geography, history, and imaginative representations of the other. Said heard at least some of the stories about the migrant saint who was many centuries ago entombed in the shrine, and he eventually retold those same stories to newcomers and the young. I recount the founding myth of that shrine in the paper I submitted for the conference, but I won't have time to do so here. I'll skip ahead now to how we come to learn of Said's existence and the implications of finding him this way. History, colonial history, and saints, slaves, and shrines. Colonel S.B. Miles, a British officer with a long service in the region, visited Dhofar in December 1884, and he reported that the tomb of the Samiri was still there in the Riz, a half-day sail from Salalah. This was the site of Said's plantation labor and his beloved Samiri shrine. Miles found the shrine standing a half-mile in from the sea, though in a derelict state. He reported that the locals believed rain fell in Dhofar as a result of the saint's blessing, and that out of fear that the rains would stop, a small subscription was taken up in order to effect some mostly minor repairs. He interviewed an old Qadi by the name of Sayyid Ahmed, who told him about the local tribes and the saint As-Samiri. Miles writes, I interviewed here the old Qadi Sayyid Ahmed, who gave me some information about the Gara tribe and about the Samiri. He informed me that the Samiri was a converted kafir, and it was through his sanctity Dhofar was first blessed with rain. Before this time, the water of heaven had never fallen. His tomb was now a ziyarat, or shrine, and visited by all sorts and conditions of men. And his name was included with the other emirs, anbiyas, and ulamas, and was prayed to whenever the rain was required by the people of the district. The tomb of the Samiri lies about half a mile from the sea, and it's enclosed by an unroofed wall of mud and stones 25 feet by 10. The grave being 18 feet by 4, lying north and south, with a broken headstone of black basalt or limestone. The inscription is imperfect. The lower part, bearing the date, has disappeared, while at the foot of the tomb is a small cavity for holding oil, the lamp being kept lit throughout the year by the devotees. The roof of the building collapsed many years ago, but last year a slave named Said saw the saint in a dream and was warned that if the tomb was left exposed to the sun, the whole district would be parched for want of rain. A subscription was therefore raised and some repairs were effected, but sufficient funds to renew the roof were not available. The most complete account of this saint, whose tomb is the principal shrine in Oman, is that given in Mr. W. Logan's Malabar. So the slave named Said in Miles's account is the same Said whom we've already met. The former made an entrance on the historical stage through this fleeting mention of his existence in a colonial official's travel memoir. On that stage, his agency is highly circumscribed, limited to having dreams of saints and visions of doom, but also calling for action, we must note, talking out of turn, as it were. Nevertheless, so precisely because he asserted himself, history must discipline the slave's narrative. It cannot do otherwise and remain history, at least to the mainstream of the profession. History allows us to access the richly textured world in which Said was a slave, but it cannot grant us a view of the slave as a richly textured person named Said. This is where we might take lessons from historians of medieval and early modern times who have stretched disciplinary boundaries and introduced literary techniques to imaginatively represent the lives of European peasants and women. Carlo Ginzburg and Natalie Seaman Davis, among others, have shown us how to read sparse textual references creatively or against the grain of voluminous sources to reveal the possible interior lives of marginal actors who would otherwise forever remain but stick figures in grand narratives with only grand actors. Though echoing Matthew Hopper here from his book Slaves of One Master, I would say that as historians of worlds subordinated to European colonial and or imperial power, we need heed the warnings of Eve Trout Powell. In an early article on the invisibility of African slaves in Middle Eastern historiography, Powell returns to Gayatri Spivak's famous critique of the subaltern voice as a specific form of impossibility, an aporia signaling on multiple levels the limits of modern representation. The simultaneous and imbricated births of colonialism and modernity, as many post-colonial critics have shown, ensured that knowledge produced about human beings, whether at home or abroad, albeit with significant differences, engendered a whole host of power relations, particularly when that knowledge purported to scientific methods and accuracy. Accordingly, in the context of slavery, a historian trained in the discipline, however diligent in her research, is doomed to re-objectify the enslaved to one degree or another. There are very few active scholars naive enough to believe that they are giving voice or agency to the other. Although today we may only hear those lines infrequently, a certain liberal sensibility, similar to the one that underlay many a colonial project, that makes this thought possible continues to pervade Western academia and often among historians with a purposeful misreading or partial reading of Spivak and Edward Said. There is a presupposition deep within our epistemological edifice, intersecting with our modern psyche, that some good might come out of what we are doing. Why else do it? Only the most callous and, dare I say, clueless would reply, for the money. In a broader sense, the secular humanist project purporting to be universalist all too often exposes itself as particular and moralistic, especially when confronting unassimilable Muslim others like Said, Fadl, and the Samiri. Among historians, I would venture to say post-colonial critique has been viewed in the current century as a dead end. Hopper and more recently Leila Portawaf, for example, both launched sophisticated critiques of the extant historiography on slavery in the Middle East to open space for better positivist histories, less freighted by the careers of Orientalism, liberal imperialism, and Atlantic slavery as a historical model. The prospect of producing post-Orientalist histories in which the West has been displaced as center, however, remains more a vision than a realized plan. In Hopper and Portawaf's admittedly sophisticated histories of slavery in Eastern Arabia and Iran, respectively, the urge to recuperate and restore agency on the model of the liberal subject remains strong. That said, the major advantage of taking stock of historical change from a trans-regional arena such as the Indian Ocean world, with its African, Asian, Islamic, and other entwinements, might be that it offers a critical vantage point onto our received narratives of how the modern world was made, as well as being a rich site for the production of narratives that are not always already bound to fit within the modernist, secularist, nationalist box. Indeed, the absence of local slave narratives or loud calls for historical commemoration might encourage a move away from the anthropocentrism that enables moralistic history writing with its villains, victims, and heroes, and its ineluctable occlusion of non-human agents. Subaltern prophecies, a world historical El Nino, and the Anthropocene. The dream which Said had around 1883 suggests that the shrine had fallen into disrepair over the course of several years. As mentioned, Said Fadl arrived in Dhofar in late 1875. Discontented pastoralists ejected him in 1879. Discontented, maybe putting it mildly, severe droughts in the mid-1870s in Dhofar resulted in loss of crops, human and non-human animal life, and population displacements, which seem to have directly led to the rebellion against Said Fadl. Said, like others, would have had no way of knowing that Fadl's tenure in Dhofar from 1876 to 1879 overlapped exactly with the onset of an extreme global El Nino event that devastated entire communities around the world and gave rise to new material realities. Though he would have known that many people blamed Fadl for their suffering because of his mismanagement of already scarce resources, or less materially, because of his spiritual impotence with the failure of his barakah to bring the rains. In a sense, Fadl had been given the boot because his CV, which his employers had seen before he was hired, did not match his actual skills once he was on the job. The climate catastrophe did not need a name. Explanations were nevertheless offered, and blame was laid at the feet of someone who had claimed a supernatural hookup. Said was less quick to judge, especially since other more local actors had let the Samiri shrine fall into ruin. Although we have nothing but the thinnest sliver of what historians consider evidence, when Said is viewed through the lens of the shrines that dotted the Indian Ocean rim, we can somewhat soundly speculate about the life he saw himself living. Said and Samiri became spiritual kin and embodied entombed companions to the transformative powers of the shrine. Therefore, he felt keenly that the migrant saint's resting place had to be maintained. Its survival and solidity would determine the fortunes of Dhofar as it had for generations. The saint's intercession was necessary for God's blessings to be bestowed on him and on the varied peoples of Dhofar. And even more so, he thought, on the land itself, which preceded and exceeded the successive generations that called it home. Thank you.
Thank you, Wilson. Our third panelist, Akshay Sarathi, is a lecturer in the Department of Anthropology at Texas A&M. The title of his talk is Fish, shellfish, and commerce, the interplay of subsistence and economics in East Africa's Indian Ocean links. Please.
Thank you for having me, and thank you to the Africa Institute for organizing this amazing conference. I think I was telling somebody else that I believe that my perspective on a lot of subjects concerning the Indian Ocean world have actually been transformed by listening to my respected colleagues present their points of view. I'm probably the only archaeologist at the conference, so I'm bringing a very materialistic, I'm sure slightly offensively positivistic perspective to studies of the Indian Ocean, which I'm sure will irritate some people, but I really look forward to your critiques of the evidence that I'm going to be presenting today and the theoretical model that I hope to elaborate in future publications. So I would just like to say that I'm very honored to be on a panel with Dr. Machado and Dr. Wilson, because I have followed their work for a while, and I consider them stellar scholars of the Indian Ocean world. So today I will be focusing on how fish, shellfish, and creolized culinary or subsistence practices connect East Africa to the Indian Ocean world in complex ways. But first, I need to acknowledge, though, that the title of my talk is a little bit misleading because it was written before I actually made the talk, in complete honesty. It's a little vague on what kinds of fish and what kinds of shellfish I'm actually going to be discussing. So specifically in my talk today, I'm going to be focusing on the trade in preserved fish along the East African coast and the use and circulation of money cowries specifically within the African continent. In my abstract, I also focus exclusively on fish and shellfish in my statement on creolized culinary traditions. Again, this was rendered inaccurate as I conducted my research for this talk because I discovered that the incorporation of so many different kinds of biota from the Indian Ocean world as foods into East Africa's culinary sphere just completely transformed how I viewed the consumption of local fish and shellfish, right? And specifically how these introduced biota from the Indian Ocean world were indigenized or creolized in East African culinary contexts. I must admit that after listening to Dr. Hoffmeyer's talk yesterday and in conversations with her, I am a little bit hesitant to use the term creolization now because I realize that historians use the term very, very differently from how archaeologists and perhaps cultural anthropologists do so. So I would be delighted in the question and answer round or later to discuss how, as archaeologists, we perceive creolization and indigenization processes. So today my talk will specifically deal with the interplay between ecology, commerce, subsistence, and culture to understand East African entanglements with the Indian Ocean world. I will broadly survey examples drawn from the archaeological, historical, and ethnographic literature, but as an archaeologist, I must note that my instinct is to turn almost naturally to the material record first and explore any topic and its manifestation in deep time. But today I have attempted to cross disciplinary boundaries in order to gain a more complete understanding of the subjects that I would present here today. The theoretical framework that I employ in understanding the circulation of preserved fish, cowries, and the transformation of culinary traditions in East Africa is based on what my advisor, Dr. Henry Bunn, and I call the concept of social taphonomies. I'll explore this concept later in some detail, but in brief, for now, this concept draws on paradigms in paleontology and archaeology where the concept of taphonomy was developed to understand how natural objects, right, objects from the natural world are turned into cultural objects. I must note that my discussion today of the complex cultural phenomena surrounding preserved fish, the circulation of cowries, and creolized food traditions only samples the available evidence. So I would like to emphasize that the examples I present here are broadly representative of larger cultural trends whose complexity precludes me from discussing them within a 20-minute talk. So I was drawn to these cultural activities through my ethnographic and archaeological research on the maritime cultures of Zanzibar, where Dr. Miriam is from. This island is known locally as Unguja Island. As an ethno-zooarchaeologist who studies the exploitation of marine fauna by humans, my research has focused on marine subsistence activities in Zanzibari fishing communities, in particular like Jambiani on the southeastern coast, and in some archaeological sites like Unguja Uku on the southwestern coast and on Kizimkazi Dimbani on the southern coast. Focusing for a second on Unguja Uku, this is a very significant site for the history of Zanzibar and the Indian Ocean world because it is a very early trading port that we have evidence of this far south along the East African coast. I excavated it in 2018 along with my colleagues in the Department of Museums and Antiquities in the Revolutionary Government of Zanzibar, and we discovered links, very strong links that date to the 7th century between East Africa, South Asia, and the Middle East. The site seems to have been abandoned in the 11th century or so, most likely due to the silting up of its harbor, but other scholars have speculated that as Islam spread south along the East African coast, its association with pre-Islamic religious practices might have made it untenable as a settlement, especially one concerned with trade. In my study of the shellfish excavated at Unguja Uku, I was struck by the relative absence of money cowries, that is Monetaria moneta and Monetaria annulis at this site, and the general insignificance of all cowries at the site. While some large species like tiger cowries, that is Cypraea tigris, were consumed at the site in some quantities, they formed a relatively small proportion of the overall consumption of shellfish at the site. The absence of money cowries at Unguja Uku was surprising given their later significance in Africa as not just currency but in other contexts as well. That is the last slide I have with any sort of statistics on it, I promise. While I had intended to base my discussion of shellfish in this talk on how the climate and local Indian Ocean ecologies influenced shellfish exploitation on the East African coast, specifically focusing on my ethnographic research in Jambiani, I realized that given recent research into the role played by cowries, Monetaria moneta and Monetaria annulus in particular, in East and Southern Africa in archaeological context, especially by my friend Abigail Moffett, I figured that they would serve as a much more interesting topic. I should mention that and emphasize that although I do describe these two species as money cowries, I do not mean to de-emphasize their other uses. As I will show in a few minutes, they played very, very significant ideological roles in Africa as well. Anthropologists, archaeologists, and historians have long noted the significance of these cowries, these money cowries, these two species in Africa, not just as currency, but also as objects imbued with ritual and ideological significance that were often used to indicate the elite or religious status of the owner or wearer. Right. I should note here that cowries are not the only shell money further used in Africa. Olivella shells were used in the Kingdom of Congo and was specifically and systematically harvested from Luanda Island in the Atlantic Ocean for use within the Kingdom of Congo. While money cowries are surprisingly rare at Unguja Uku, a site located on the Indian Ocean coast where you would expect a larger proportion of these two species and of larger cowries as well, given the site's proximity to the ocean and harvesting grounds of these cowries, even a small number of them found at an interior archaeological site, such as Shankare, indicate their significance in pre-colonial African context dating to relatively the distant past. Shankare is an archaeological site located at near Philabborwa in South Africa, the star over there. During its occupation between the 10th and 14th century CE, Shankare seems to have not been drawn into the political and economic orbit of powerful regional centers like Mapungubwe, right, suggesting to excavators that the circulation of imported objects like glass beads from across the Indian Ocean world and cowries again from the Indian Ocean coast was linked with the activities of craft producers rather than elites. Whether this is a convincing explanation for the presence of these exotic quote-unquote exotic objects in sites like Sharjah, which are not part of the Mapangu political sphere, as far as we know, I will leave that up to you. The cowries found at Shankare were modified with their dorsal, that is their top or curved surface, removed, suggesting that they were incorporated in jewelry or clothing for use as decoration in ritual and or elite activities or as currency. Even to this day, cowries are very often used to produce jewelry for sale in the tourist economy, and they are modified in exactly the same way with their dorsal surfaces removed so that they can be stitched into bracelets, necklaces, and so on. The historical accounts of the use of cowries in both East, West, and various parts of Africa emphasize their use almost primarily as currency and sort of de-emphasize their use in other contexts. Drawing primarily on European sources, many recent studies focus in particular on the mass importation of cowries from the Maldives in particular by Europeans. Oops, what's that? Well, it's going to happen during my presentation. There we go, we're back. But yeah, so many recent studies drawing on European sources in particular have focused on the use of Maldivian cowries within the African context, primarily as currency, starting at the latest, in the 17th century to satisfy local demand. The narrative is that Europeans, the French, the British, the Dutch, all stopped at the Maldives and harvested cowries to serve as ballast and then for transportation to Africa, different parts of Africa, to purchase enslaved peoples. For instance, works such as A Fistful of Shells by Toby Green emphasize the use of cowries as currency in trade in enslaved Africans from the western reaches of Africa. However, it is important to note that cowries from wherever they might have been harvested played a significant role in non-enslavement related economies as well, especially in regions like East Africa. Specifically, I'm thinking of pretty detailed historical accounts of the use of cowries as currency in local markets in the Kingdom of Buganda, in what is today Uganda, and of Heinrich Barth's study of the circulation of cowries along the Sahel, where he described specialized cowrie counters located in markets whose job it was to count cowries used in large transactions. I argue that the presence of cowrie economies, even in the interior regions of Africa, suggests that historians and ethnographers must consider different kinds of cowrie economies and different kinds of cowrie ideologies based on distance from cowrie producing or cowrie importing regions on the East African coast, which is the focus of my study today. I should note over here that cowries, Monetaria annulis and Monetaria moneta, are found endemically exclusively in the Indo-Pacific region. So all cowries found in West Africa were, by necessity, imported from the Indian Ocean world. So cowries are a great example, money cowries are a great example of how all of Africa, not just the East African coast, was drawn into Indian Ocean trade networks. As I noted in the case of Shankare, cowries played a significant role in Africa beyond their currency value. Hoggendon and Johnson Toby Green noted the role of cowries in the trade in enslaved peoples for sure, but also noted other uses of cowries in different parts of Africa, such as in bride wealth, decoration for clothing, gifts, counters, especially in Mancala-like games, and so on. In particular, I would like to emphasize the ritual uses of cowries in different regions of Africa. For instance, cowries play a significant role in some East and Southern African forms of divination. Further, different groups in Africa developed myths about the use of cowries. For instance, a myth from the Kingdom of Dahomey in West Africa, collected sometime in the middle of the 20th century, states that cowries came to be used as money or currency when the king of Dahomey threw people fattened on bananas into the ocean to feed money cowries, which were then boiled before being used as money. This myth, like others, suggests a local rather than imported source of cowries, indicating their cultural indigenization by various African populations in a manner that obfuscated their non-African or Indian Ocean origins. As I stated earlier, the studies recently focus on the trade in enslaved peoples from Africa have emphasized the key role played by the Maldive Islands in the production and distribution of cowries across the Indian Ocean world. The Maldivian origin of cowries have some antiquity. I should note that Arab and Persian geographers in particular noted their mass collection and mass processing in the Maldives for distribution across the Indian Ocean world. At least in recent centuries, cowries mass imported from the Maldives into Africa played a key role in the development of a particular kind of monetization that depended heavily on naturally occurring resources in the Indian Ocean world. However, it is important to note that cowries are relatively endemic shellfish in the Indian Ocean region and can be collected in significant quantities on the East African coast as well, as Dr. Machado mentioned. It is entirely possible that an earlier trade in cowries from the East African coast to the interior, especially at sites like Shankare, was swamped by the later mass importation of cowries from the Maldives. Moving on to preserved fish, just like with cowries, my interest in the production and trade of this commodity along the East African coast originated with my ethnographic studies in Zanzibar. These are images of preserved fish, shellfish, and cephalopods for sale at a market in Zanzibar city, where I was informed that most of these preserved animals were sourced locally. However, I was informed that the catfish on the right came from the Mafia archipelago to the south. I was unable to verify this claim, however. I should also note that small, dried, and fresh marine fish known locally as daga are traded and consumed extensively in Zanzibar and East Africa. To give you a sense of the volume of the trade in preserved marine fish along the East African coast, I present these two newspaper articles from 2020. The article on the left reports that 12 tons of preserved fish, quote-unquote, smuggled from Somalia were destroyed by Kenyan authorities. The subtext of this article seems to be that the trade in preserved fish from Somalia is a regular activity regulated only with middling success by the Kenyan government, and that fisherfolk from Kenya, quote, sneak into Somalia to conduct their activities, end quote. In the same year, another article on the right noted that Kenyan fish traders petitioned the government to reopen the border for trade in preserved fish with Somalia. The current state of preserved fish trade between Somalia and Kenya remains unknown because of the dubious legality of this trade. I was not surprised to find little archaeological evidence for trade in preserved fish along the East African coast because of the difficulty in distinguishing them from fish consumed or traded fresh. However, I must note that archaeologists working in the Eastern Mediterranean and in the Indus Valley civilization have made extensive strides in identifying archaeological patterns, archaeological trade patterns in preserved fish. However, the historical and ethnographic data for East African coastal preserved fish is very robust, especially for the last few centuries. Historical and ethnographic accounts of the East African coast make some mention of the trade in both fresh and preserved fish, and it should come as no surprise that fish played a significant role in regional economies. European officials in the 19th and 20th centuries noted the extensive fish trade along the coast in Kenya, Tanzania, Zanzibar, and various Indian Ocean islands. References to the trade in preserved fish are often frustratingly brief, offering scant description of processes of preservation. Regarding the preserved fish in Somalia, though, to give us a case study, the historian Wayne Durrell offers more detail in his account of the Majeerteen Sultanate in the 19th century, noting that the Majeerteen exported preserved fish from several Somali Indian Ocean ports to regions further south in Kenya and Zanzibar in exchange for goods like African millet. By 1850, African millet had, for some unexplained reason, replaced rice in the Somali diet and was exchanged further for tree gum brought to the coast by Somali herding populations. Preserved fish then were integrated into a complicated trading network that spanned the East African coast, in which regional specialization allowed for the economic interdependence of different parts of the coast. I will note that while some historians and ethnographers emphasize the key role played by preserved fish and other preserved meats during times of famine or transition, I do argue that they have played a key and complex economic role in East Africa beyond times of transition or famine. You would think also that my interest in creolized creolized cooking traditions in East Africa developed due to my experiences in Zanzibar. However, it developed a lot earlier when I was an undergraduate. I had intended to discuss creolized preparation methods of fish and shellfish, but I quickly realized that a study of creolized preparation methods could not be divorced from the spread of Indian Ocean biota to East Africa, biota that were indigenized into regional food traditions to create an Afro-Indian Ocean cuisine. Multiple studies have placed East African food consumption in the broader context of the Indian Ocean world, drawing on archaeological, historical, and ethnographic records to document the arrival and indigenization of Indian Ocean culinary traditions in East Africa. However, these studies have also emphasized the key role played by Africa in exporting foods to the Indian Ocean world, such as with the spread of finger millet from Africa outwards. While some Indian Ocean biota, like spices and domesticated animals, show up fairly early in sites along the Red Sea, especially in Egypt, I would like to focus on the spread of Islam and its catalytic role in the spread of Indian Ocean culinary biota to East Africa and their indigenization in regional cuisines. Historical accounts, such as those of Ibn Battuta, offer some insight not only into the spread of food and food cultures like the consumption of pan from the Indian Ocean world to East Africa. It is not until the spread of Islam in the Indian Ocean region that we see a significant archaeological and historical evidence upsurge for the spread of Indian Ocean foods and their adoption within culinary traditions in East Africa. For instance, the site of Qasr al-Qadim in Egypt evidences a seismic shift in culinary traditions and the regional production of food between its late Roman and early Islamic periods. On the Swahili coast, the Islamic period starting around 1,000 years ago was also characterized by a significant shift in the use of imported and local vessels of feasting, along with the import of spices and condiments like poppy and pepper. Ibn Battuta, coming back to him in the 14th century, describes a lavish feast at Mogadishu consisting of rice with spiced relishes, lemon, ginger, mango, arecanut, and betel leaves. Exotic foods from across the Indian Ocean world begin to play a significant role in elite feasts across the East African coast during this time period. Local marine fauna were joined with exotic Indian Ocean elements to highlight elite status in many contexts. I should note, though, that the spread of Islamic culinary traditions was not absolute and was very often a negotiated process. Many foods considered haram continued to be consumed regularly in parts of East Africa. This applies even to pigs. I would like to discuss briefly a theoretical framework that I would be happy to discuss in some detail after this talk, drawing on ideas of taphonomy. Taphonomy, or the laws of burial in paleontology or archaeology, refers to the study of processes that affect organic materials after death, including decay, preservation, and fossilization. Traditionally, it focuses on how environmental factors transform biological remains into what scientists like me recover. I argue that the concept of social taphonomies expands this to consider culturally embedded processes that shape the faunal or artifactual record. These include activities like butchery, cooking and discarding of meat, trade, which reflect social, economic, and ideological choices. By examining these processes, social taphonomies reveal how cultural behaviors, rather than purely environmental factors, influence the preservation and interpretation of past human interactions with their environment. Further, social taphonomies allow us to consider the transformation of natural objects like fish, cowries, and imported biota from the Indian Ocean world into cultural objects. I argue that this concept can be effectively used to explore how East Africans transformed objects drawn from local and transoceanic ecologies into the cultural objects I discussed here today. To conclude, the approach presented here reframes East Africa not as a peripheral participant, but an active agent in shaping Indian Ocean ecologies, networks, and influences. By focusing on the ecological underpinnings of commerce and the cultural dimensions of cuisine, it presents a holistic view of East Africa's historical integration into this very interconnected world. The use of the concept of social taphonomies allows us to theorize about the cultural transformation of the natural world in Indian Ocean East Africa in a cross-disciplinary way. Thank you for your time. Look at that, I have 1 minute left. Yeah.
Thanks to all our panelists. Now, I would like to invite them to the stage for our Q&A session.
I was wondering, thinking of Pedro's and Akshay's papers together, about coconuts, and the various uses in the Lusophone Indian Ocean, from copra to rope, coir, and various other things, but also the idea of coconut plantations. Interestingly, the government in Goa has recently classified coconuts as a grass. So that you can kind of do stuff with the trees. But I was wondering if there is something in the late medieval, early modern period that allows for certain kinds of geographies of extraction, and whether the Portuguese might be, for example, playing, or even Goans in a kind of sub-imperial sense may have played conduits, the kind of cultural manipulations that you're talking about, because it's not simply kind of just there, right? And we kind of just take it for granted. Similar things could be asked about the neem tree, for example, or certain kinds of flowering plants that have come to India from the African coast. So I wonder if you could say a little bit, connecting also with yesterday's discussion of plant ecology. It's because of these marine animal products. Yeah.
Coconuts are a really interesting study from an archaeological context because they spread naturally as well as by human agency across the Indian Ocean world. So we have evidence of the natural spread of coconuts, but a lot of scholars have emphasized that with the intensification of Indian Ocean trade networks starting around 2,000, 2,500 years ago, you had the purposeful transportation of coconuts across the Indian Ocean to the Persian coast by the Parthians and later the Sasanians, and then to the Mediterranean. I do believe, though, that the natural spread of coconuts in the Indian Ocean world makes them a difficult object to consider exclusively from the human point of view. But I think that you can definitely understand how they were indigenized and creolized in different parts of the Indian Ocean world. So just they might be the same tree and the same species that you might encounter in different parts of the Indian Ocean world, but they're perceived and used in very different ways. You brought up the example of neem as well. Neem plays a very significant role in Zanzibar. Dr. Maria would probably would agree with me. Am I right in saying neem is called marabaini, right? The tree of the 40 uses. So it's considered to have 40 medicinal and other uses in Zanzibar. I was thinking about the discussions yesterday of plant ecologies as well, and I think that our understanding of those ecologies can be integrated seamlessly into our understanding of animal ecologies, because the spread and use of plants and animals very much mirror each other in the Indian Ocean world, both in the archaeological and in the historic record. Speaking of copra, I was able to discover just one little piece of charred copra from a site dating to about 900 years ago in the south part of Zanzibar. So it gave me some little insight into how coconuts were being used in this part of the world as well. And I think, when we think about plant ecologies in the Indian Ocean world, we think of these, spectacular examples like coconut and neem and all, but it's also important to think of the examples brought up, like those brought up by Dr. Hoffmeyer yesterday, which are less well known, such as the use of medicinal plants that were transported from India to East Africa and indigenized, right, within East African medicinal traditions as well. So, yeah.
Just really briefly, that I think, on the Lusophone Indian Ocean, if we can use that, term, I think, plant ecologies and the kind of movement of plants is under, researched, at least is my sense. Certainly for the periods that I look at, though there is some work on, medicinal plants, and the sort of, and the importance of Goa, thinking of the work of Timothy Walker. for an earlier period. Yeah, but plant ecologies, it's perhaps more developed for, like, if we can use this term also, for the sort of Lucifer Atlantic, but not so much for the Lucifer Indian Ocean. Yeah.
Thank you for these wonderful presentations. I was connecting back to some of the discussion in Philip Goodling's work yesterday and Pedro, your presentation, and also sort of linking forward to Wilson's work. In global conservation nowadays, there's a lot of debate about rights of the non-human species and rights of nature and who speaks for nature. And so when we think about material entanglement as a way of thinking about agency of different types, I wonder what it says, one, about the notion of dead capital in Marxism, and then thinking about the enabling of animal agency through the use of human labor, which means that there are probably entanglements of human and non-human species agencies which co-produce both of those agencies in a sense. And I kept wondering if this actually sheds new light on this whole notion of non-human agency, and whether that notion is even viable from a non-anthropocentric perspective. I mean, where is, we can't consider the animal perspective because they don't speak to us, right? So I thought this was some interesting discussion here, and I hope I'm making myself clear, but if you could speak to that, that'd be wonderful.
I think we can go on by what we have good enough time so that we keep this conversation.
Sure. Yeah, and here again, in drawing on this fabulous work of Jonathan Saha on colonial Burma, I mean, I think this notion of dead and undead capital, I think, is useful, and the sort of adaptation of Donna Haraway's work, I think, does offer a sort of an opening to think anew about certainly the elephant-human sort of interaction and engagement and entanglement, and it's also why I was at, if not quite pains, but I talked about the tusk economy and not this sort of ivory economy very specifically, very deliberately, because I think, tusks, of course, are an organic, material also, but they undergo, through these entanglements, a process of commodification. But the animal sort of is often abstracted or kind of left behind. And of course, tusks are themselves undergoing a process of abstraction and sort of flattening through then certain, through the customs house, the imperial customs house, but also, on Gujarati, vessels through, though I haven't found evidence of this, there is for the later 19th century around things like, pearling, sort of Gujarati, like accounting, mechanisms that, further sort of flatten and commodify tusks into ivory. But yeah, I think this idea of material entanglements and the co-constitution, the mutual kind of constitution, and that relationality between human and non-human through the elephant-human encounters, I think, a productive way forward.
Actually, I was struck yesterday by something you said about the incentivization of Global South scientists, right, to participate in the solar geoengineering plans, and then listening to Pedro talk about agency not, drawn from some sort of animal subjectivity, but through these material entanglements. They're actually very helpful moments in thinking about where this paper of mine comes from, right? And I think it is a kind of disillusionment with the moment, right, where agency, which enables someone like Trump and his followers to deride inclusion or diversity and equity, where it's a sort of, in their minds, a way of sidelining the failures of the Democrats to deal with people's real material issues, which is of course quite ironic and hilarious in that they're not going to do anything about those material realities either. But one finds it in Canadian institutions where people are incentivized to talk about agencies in very specific, sort of liberal, subjective ways in which inclusion is about sort of, you've got a black one here, you got a brown one here, you've got a gay one, you have a polka dotted one. And the material entanglements that allow the reproduction of vast differences in the division of intellectual labor, for example, internationally. It doesn't have to be treated, right? Because you've hired your Indian, you've hired your African. The fact that Western institutions are thoroughly sort of, and we see that now, especially with Gaza, right? That Western institutions are one might say bankrupt in the way that a person like Qudsi might see it, right? In that they can sit by and allow a genocide to take place, right? So whither the humanities, right? Or humanity, forget about that, but the humanities cannot sort of grapple with something like a genocide or with the implications of capitalism and climate change. I mean, they can, but what is sort of heard or allowed to be heard in Western academic contexts that one sees, especially in the hiring process. So I'm senior enough to be involved in hiring of people, right? And to sort of see what the administrators want, right? They don't want you to deal with those material entanglements because their salaries, which have gone up and up and up, and their numbers have gone up and up and up, are part of those material entanglements. So they're happy to sort of allow people to go on about their victimization which isn't to say none of that is right, none of that is relevant or it's not true. In this paper, what one sees a lot of is this debate, that there is a debate, right, on how much victimization should be included in the histories of slavery, where does it get us? And I didn't get into that because part of it just seemed to be going around in circles, right? And so the paper was an attempt to try and, I think come to terms with a contemporary moment that doesn't offer a lot by way of inspiration for ideas and so on.
Thank you. Thank you all. So I'm a novice to cowries as money, so I would like to ask if you can say a little more about how value gets attached to it and how it's different from, let's say, coin money and why it was abandoned. So was there like a particular monopoly on the farming or the harvesting? Because it seems as if it's open access and you can just, get more cowries and so that.
That's a great question, and it's something that I've been thinking about as well. So cowries are a great example of currency-like objects that mimic the characteristics of currency that make them so good as tokens of value, right? They can't be, they're better than coins in many ways because they can't be forged, right? If you find a cowrie, it's a cowrie. They have units of value that are very often determined by local economies as well as as well as by ideological value and meanings attached to these cowries. In terms of the production of cowries, apparently it's not all money cowries that are okay to be circulated. Speaking to the value of them, it's very much tied into the production processes. So for instance, I can't remember if it was an Arab source or a European source, but they discuss in detail the production of mass quantities of mani cowries in the Maldives. And these are very carefully farmed. You cut down coconut fronds and you lay them in the water for these shellfish to attach to them. Then you collect these, and apparently there were multiple experiments, whether you boil them to get rid of the meat, whether you leave them out to rot, whether you bury them, right? Because apparently in some contexts in the Indian Ocean world, the shinier they are, the more value they have, right? And in some instances, the two species do have different value. So for instance, Monetaria moneta might have significantly less value than Monetaria annulus because of the gold ring that's present on Monetaria annulus. So a lot of the value does depend on local understandings of what is okay, what is assigned to these shells. But your question about the production of these shells is really interesting, right? And even the West African myth that I mentioned about, feeding people bananas, making them fat and throwing them into the ocean, I didn't mention the full myth, but basically it does seem to draw on some understanding of cowrie harvesting practices, because the whole myth is that you tie a rope to these humans, dump them in the ocean, let the shellfish feed on them, and then pull the rope out with the shellfish attached. So that's surprisingly similar to how the Maldivians are doing it, where they're putting palm fronds in the water, coconut fronds in the water, and removing the coconut fronds as the shellfish are attached to them. So, there does seem to be some understanding of how these are harvested. But like I said, there's been almost an overemphasis on the Maldivian production of cowries rather than other production techniques as well. We know, for instance, that the Andaman and Nicobar Islands are great sources of cowries as well, and they possibly might have played an even earlier role than the Maldivian cowries in circulation with what is today southern China. In the Lake Dian culture, for instance, where you have gigantic bronze drums that are just filled to the brim with cowries, right? So it really does depend on where these cowries are being produced and the local value attached to them. That's not just economic, but also ideological. Sorry, it's a very long-winded answer to your question.
There are two questions here.
A very good afternoon. My name is Abdullah Sabo. Thank you very much to our wonderful panelists. My question is to Pedro. Looking at the dynamics of the ivory and shell trading within the Indian Ocean, one may wonder to what extent this, as regards human and animal interaction, has impact on the environment. And secondly, apart from hunting that was used to acquire the ivory, is there any method that was used? Thank you. As regards the human and animal interactions and the trading, that's the ivory and shell trading, I was just wondering to what extent has it impact on the environment?
So, that's a big question, and as Philip Gooding yesterday was giving us a sense of. I think there are various factors, quite how in the period that I'm looking at. So this earlier sort of 18th century period, I think I think we need to know a lot more, which also Philip didn't sort of get into, is patterns of elephant migration itself, right? How those shift and change in relation to humans, but also in relation to other factors that don't necessarily involve humans. So the sort of the ecological impact of sustained and kind of heavy hunting from certainly the 16th and 17th centuries that intensifies from the mid 18th century forward. It's not entirely unclear. It's much clearer for the 19th, where herds are sort of decimated. But again, as Philip mentioned, yesterday, that Ivory Frontier idea has been, which was then Abdul Sharif's book, for instance, and in other work, has been we've moved away from that idea because there are herds, there are pockets of herds in different parts of of coastal East Africa, of northern Mozambique, in the interior of central Mozambique. But quite what the impact of this hunting is, I think, at least to me, is somewhat unclear. Certainly broadly, of course, herds are denuded, but the degree of that, I think we need a lot more, work, on that. And then, sorry, the second question, which I didn't sleep last night at all. I'm in this, sort of crazed, sort of state. So, I feel like I'm about to pass out. But, please, could you restate your second question?
Apart from hunting, is there any method they use to acquire this ivory from the elephants?
No, it's. I think there is some evidence of, of course, sort of natural elephant, death, and kind of opportunistically, in a sense, taking advantage of that to extract, tusks. But overwhelmingly, it is hunting, and hunting sort of groups, and hunting cultures that I mentioned, the Chakunda, formerly enslaved, important communities in the Zambezi Valley, for whom hunting becomes sort of central to the emergence of Chakunda identity. Actually, and so it is hunting and sustained hunting, and then again, as Philip Gooding yesterday sort of mentioned, the political importance of ivory hunting and as a form of wealth creation, but also as a source of political kind of power that really develops in some important ways in the 19th century. But it's there already, for the Marabri Confederacy, for instance, in an earlier century, it's there. So yeah, but it's sort of specifically hunting. Some of it again is for subsistence, needs, not exclusively for ivory necessarily. But by I think by the middle of the 18th century, increasingly that's not the case. It's hunting to extract tusks.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. My question is for Professor Jacob. I know you've written an article in which you kind of express a sort of pessimism about, thinking Said Fadl and critical theory. But I was wondering, listening to your talk today, I thought it was kind of exciting in the ways in which the story of Samiri is perhaps only possible because you've already told the story of Said Fadl. And I wanted to see whether or not that's a correct interpretation of a kind of cumulative building, or if you think it's more of a different departure.
Yeah, the Samiri exists beyond me. Like the myth history that I didn't recount, as I says in the paper, is of the last Chera emperor of South India, who apparently gives up his throne and divides up Kerala among his princes, and goes to Mecca because he heard that the Prophet is, has received truth. And he had heard from Muslim travelers who were going to Sri Lanka to see Adam's footprint, and they took him with them on their return voyage. And so the reason he believed them is that he had this dream. There's always a dream about two moons splitting. I forget exactly how the dream goes, and they could explain it to him because the Prophet had had a similar revelation, and so he wanted to go meet this Prophet, and he planned to return, but he dies after he meets the Prophet and is converted to Islam. And on his return voyage, he dies in Salalah, or off the coast there, and that's the shrine. And that's how the story goes. And as you saw in that last slide, it does exist beyond me and my telling of Said Fadl's history. It's all over Facebook and Google Maps. And if you go to Google Maps, there are frequent visitors from Malabar, from Kerala, who visit and post pictures. And the most recent is quite odd and sad. And Said would be very dismayed that somebody, I don't know if it's the government of Oman, dismantled the shrine. They can't touch the graves, but the shrine has been dismantled. I haven't looked further into what the politics of that are, but yeah, I don't think that the Samiri depends on me of my telling of Said Fadl's history, because there's a whole Indian Ocean and beyond, right? In North Carolina, I do recount this in the book, in North Carolina, there are people who reproduce the story of the Samiri, and very particular details about how Injipuli, which is this Kerala delicacy, a condiment, is brought, to the Prophet. And it was part of the Samiri myth, which gets reproduced century after century after century, circulates, via Portuguese sources, via Dutch, Danish. So yeah, you guys are hearing about it maybe because I wrote a book about Said Fadl. Thank you.
I would like to thank our panelists once again for, please join me. And I think collectively your papers illustrate quite remarkably the potentials of the environmental turn in Indian Ocean studies that is taking place, and we'll see how this will shape the field as a whole. We will now go for lunch from 12 to 1:30 p.m. We'll enjoy some food and company together, and then we'll reconvene for the first panel in the afternoon. Thank you.